Okay, 7th grade, happy Friday. So today we are back in our writing packet. So as always with the writing packet, we're on page 17. We're going to start with a journal entry. So these you guys have to do independently because obviously I can't tell you how you feel about each journal prompt. But this time it's asking you, what do you think is the greatest challenge students face today? Use reasons and examples to support your opinion. So I think that there's a lot of challenges that you guys can think of, especially with this e-learning stuff. But if you want to stick to like challenges you face when you're in school, that's completely fine. But just to help you kind of think of ideas, you could think more so with like e-learning and stuff like that. So as always, you guys are doing one paragraph for these, which is how many sentences? 5 to 7. Yeah. So that's what you guys need to do for page 17. So we're going to move on to page 18 together. So last time we talked about the different types of sentences. So we talked about simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, and compound complex sentences. So this time we're talking specifically about complex and compound complex sentences. So we're going more into depth with just those two. So as always, a clause is a group of words with both a subject and a predicate. Now, how does that differ from a phrase? A phrase has either a subject, a predicate, or neither one. A clause has to have both. So a subject is what the sentence is talking about. A predicate is the verb or what the subject is doing. So an independent clause can stand alone. A dependent clause cannot. A dependent clause usually begins with a subordinating conjunction, which we've talked about before. It's those words that kind of leave us wondering what else the author is going to say. So those words might be while, because, although, after, things like that, or a relative pronoun such as who, that, or which. And there's other words that it can begin with, but most of them are going to begin with either those subordinating conjunctions or relative pronouns. So a complex sentence, just like we talked about the other day, has an independent clause and at least one dependent clause. So one independent clause could be more than one, but usually just one dependent clause. So, while many people enjoy music, that's our dependent clause. It begins with that word while, which is the subordinating conjunction. If you just said, while many people enjoy music, and stopped, that would leave people wondering, while many people enjoy music, what? Like, what else are you going to say? There needs to be more to it than that. But if you said, some scientists think that it also makes them smarter, that makes sense on its own. So, that's our independent clause. So this is a complex sentence. One dependent clause, one independent clause. Same thing down here. Scientists have done studies. That's a complete thought. Independent clause. That suggests a link between music and reading skills. Wouldn't make sense on its own. It's a dependent clause. Put them together. That makes a complex sentence. Now, a compound complex sentence has at least two, usually only two, but at least two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is those fanboy words, which I'll go ahead and write them over here. That's for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So these are the most common coordinating conjunctions, the words for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. So those are coordinating conjunctions, which we also use when we're writing compound sentences. So when we're doing a compound complex sentence, it's two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, as well as one dependent clause. So basically what it is it's a compound sentence with a dependent clause thrown in there somewhere also. So in this example, they say scientists have made some important discoveries about music. That makes sense on its own. That's our first independent clause. This research has encouraged people. That's our second independent clause. This word and is our coordinating conjunction. And then who want school music programs to continue. That does not make sense on its own. That's going to be our dependent clause. So we have independent clause, coordinating conjunction, second independent clause, finished off with a dependent clause. So scientists have made some important discoveries about music, and this research has encouraged people who want school music programs to continue. So now we're going to do this practice together at the bottom. It says identify each sentence type by writing compound or complex or compound complex. Underline the dependent clauses in each sentence. So, in every single sentence, there's going to be a dependent clause because a complex has one dependent clause, compound complex also has one dependent clause. And then we're going to write whether it's complex or compound complex. So the hint says, remember, a complex sentence has one independent clause. A compound complex sentence has to have at least two independent clauses. Both types have at least one dependent clause, like I just said. So, researchers have found interesting connections between music and brain activity. If we stop there, does that make sense on its own? Yes, so that's not going to be a dependent clause. That's going to be an independent clause. Now, how about, although the results are not final? That doesn't make sense on its own because we're wondering, although the results aren't final, what? Right? So, although the results are not final is our dependent clause. Now, we have one dependent clause, one independent clause. That's going to be a complex sentence. Because in order to be a compound complex sentence, we need two independent clauses as well as a coordinating conjunction. When college students in one study had received musical training before age 12, they were able to remember more words from a list than students who had not received training. So if I just said, when college students in one study had received musical training before age 12 and stopped, you would be wondering, when they received musical training before age 12, what? What does that mean? So that's going to be a dependent clause, because it leaves us wanting more information. They were able to remember more words from a list than students who had received no training. That is just a complete thought, one sentence, which means we have another complex sentence, because we have one dependent, one independent. In another study, students had higher reading scores after 7 months if they had received daily music lessons, and their scores remained high after a year. If I said, in another study, students had higher reading scores after 7 months. If I said that, does that make sense on its own? Yes. Now, if I said, if they had received daily music lessons, does that make sense on its own? No. So, the way that you separate one independent clause from a dependent clause is that both of those have to have a subject and a predicate, right? So, students is our subject, had is our predicate, okay? So that's how we know that a clause has started, because we have a subject and a predicate. Now down here, when they say they, that's a second subject. So we know we're starting a new clause. So that's how we separate this from being one big clause versus being one independent and one dependent clause. So if they had received daily music lessons, they, subject, had is the predicate. So this has to be a separate clause from students had higher reading scores after 7 months. Okay? So then we have our coordinating conjunction and then we have a last clause, which is their scores remained high after a year. Does that make sense on its own? Yes, which means we have two independent clauses, one dependent clause, which means we have what type of sentence? Compound, complex. Most schools do not want to cut music programs, but some schools had no choice because they do not have enough money. So if we said most schools do not want to cut music programs, does that make sense on its own? Yes. If we said some schools have no choice, does that make sense on its own? Yes. Again, we have two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction. Now, because they do not have enough money, does that make sense on its own? No, so that's our dependent clause. Again, we're separating these because some schools is our subject, have is our predicate. We come down here, we have they is our new subject, do is our new predicate. So we know we're beginning another clause, and it doesn't make sense on its own, so it's a dependent clause, which we have two independent clauses, two dependent clauses, which makes it a compound complex sentence. So now you guys are going to go ahead and do page 19 on your own. If you guys need any help, I'll be available in office hours. Make sure you guys, I know most of you have done it already, but make sure that you submit your photos of your work either in the portfolio section, or you can message them to me on the messages or my Google Voice number, whatever works best for you guys.